The handcuffs didn't close the way he expected. The latch caught halfway, slipped, and hung there on my daughter's wrist while he tried again. No force, no shouting, just the slow, clumsy insistence of a man who believed he had authority he didn't possess. She stood still. He told her she was detained. Nothing more happened. He wore a uniform the neighborhood had never voted on, a badge no agency issued, a radio that didn't belong on civilian channels. The entire scene ended without resistance, consequence, or acknowledgement. A small, incorrect action drifting into the air like static. Only later would it matter that the same person who authorized him supervised a community institution people assumed had jurisdiction. That realization reframed the moment. The handcuffs weren't the threat. The assumption behind them was. The implications came next. Not events, not confrontation. Just the quiet understanding of what happens when someone confuses authority with ownership. How power expands when unchallenged. How it collapses when its limits are drawn with precision. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden. Just a boundary meeting pressure and refusing to move. This story isn't about outrage. It's about systems, about the way control behaves when it's exercised without oversight, about what follows when someone accustomed to obedience discovers that jurisdiction is not a belief, it's a structure. The handcuffs were only the first indicator. Everything after that was predictable. Karen Mallory's voice carried across the greenway before I even saw her. "She's trespassing," she said, loud enough for half the block to hear. Her tone wasn't angry. It was smug, the kind of certainty that comes from someone convinced rules bend to their preferences. The fake officer she brought with her stepped forward, metal cuffs already in his hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He just clamped them around my daughter's wrists like she was his property to manage. He didn't notice that I was walking toward them. He didn't see the look on her face. He didn't understand that the moment he touched her, the situation changed forever. "You don't have the authority to restrain anyone," I said, calm, flat, measured. "And that radio in your hand still broadcasts on emergency frequencies. I know exactly which ones." That stopped him. Not long enough. Just a flicker one beat where he hesitated, like a man hearing his fate travel toward him from a distance he couldn't measure. He didn't realize I wasn't guessing. "My name's Landon Reeve," I said. "The systems you're pretending to operate, I used to coordinate them for SWAT." Something in his posture collapsed without physically changing. His shoulders stayed square, but the confidence behind them went hollow. Karen didn't seem to notice. She stood beside him in her tailored blazer, arms crossed, lips tight, fully convinced she was managing a neighborhood problem rather than creating a criminal one. She looked at Mara like she was an inconvenience, not a child standing at the bench her mother carved. A bench that still held the grooves of every promise I made the night I buried my wife. That place mattered. That moment mattered. And Karen walked into it as if she owned jurisdiction over grief. Mara met my eyes. Not afraid, just stunned. Betrayed by the idea that an adult in a uniform, any uniform, would do something like this. I stepped closer. The air smelled like cut grass and cold metal, the kind of scent that makes a moment feel sharper than it should. Karen lifted her chin and pointed toward my daughter like she was citing a violation. "This area is restricted," she said. She didn't comply. Restricted. A public greenway. A bench installed long before Karen moved in. A place she had no claim to, no legal footing on, and no legitimate reason to patrol. People had stopped walking. A couple stood near the dog path, watching. Another resident paused by the mailbox cluster. Eyes everywhere. No one interfering. No one understanding what they were actually witnessing yet. I kept my voice level. "Where are you watching from?" I asked quietly, not to the crowd, not to Karen, but to the camera on my porch that had a perfect view of everything it needed to see. The fake officer's radio hissed. Not normal static. The kind of burst you hear when someone's transmitting on channels meant for tactical response teams. He didn't recognize the sound, but I did. Every frequency has a signature, like a fingerprint. His equipment didn't belong here, and the system behind it wasn't supposed to be in civilian hands at all. Karen misread my focus. "You're escalating this," she said. "Your daughter resisted." "No," I said. "You manufactured authority you never had." The cuffs clicked again when the officer tried adjusting them. A nervous movement, not confident, not controlled. The kind of adjustment someone makes when they realize the ground around them has begun to tilt. Mara's eyes glistened, not from fear, but from the weight of the humiliation. A child, restrained in front of her neighbors for sitting on a bench carved by her mother's hands. I steadied my breath. Karen thought this was the end of a rule she'd enforced. She didn't understand it was the beginning of a record I would follow to the edge of its jurisdictional limits, and those limits were already closing around her. I didn't move until the fake officer finally stepped back. The cuffs were still on Mara's wrists, his hands still hovering near her shoulder like he wasn't sure if he should touch her again or run. Karen stood beside him, still performing authority she did not possess, still blind to the fact that everything she had just done would follow her far beyond this greenway. I didn't give her another look. My focus was on my daughter, her wrists, her breathing, the way the humiliation clung to her like a cold wind that didn't belong on a quiet suburban path. "Come on," I said softly. "We're going home." I released the first cuff, then the second. The metal left faint marks on her skin, nothing severe, but enough to pull something tight inside my chest. Not anger. Just the calm recognition that we had crossed into a space with rules I understood better than Karen ever would. We walked together across the stretch of grass and toward our house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The porch light flicked on automatically as we approached, even though the sun was still high enough to warm the top railings. My house had always felt like the one place in Pinebriar Crest untouched by Karen's reach. Today, even the front steps felt different, closer to a threshold than a refuge. Inside, Mara went straight to the kitchen sink and ran her wrists under cold water. I stood in the living room, letting the stillness settle, letting the next steps arrange themselves. I didn't need emotion to guide me. Procedure had its own gravity. Through the window, I watched Karen linger on the path. She spoke to the fake officer, gesturing sharply, probably rewriting the narrative in her head, preparing her version of events. She didn't look toward the house once. That told me everything about how she assessed power. She assumed we'd retreat quietly. She assumed we'd play along with whatever story she planned to tell. She assumed there would be no outside jurisdiction stepping into her territory. Assumption was always the first crack. My porch became the new setting for the moment that followed. I stepped outside and sat on the top stair, letting the air move around me. The neighborhood was still shifting, people still talking. Someone walked a dog past the mailbox cluster. Another resident pulled into their driveway and froze when they noticed Karen standing with her officer. Their faces carried uncertainty, confusion, a growing awareness that something had happened outside the boundaries of normal HOA disputes. This was the pattern I needed to observe. Authority stretches first within silence. Then it tests reactions. Then it waits to see if anyone pushes back. Karen expected none. The victory strategy began here, not with confrontation, but with recognition from those who had witnessed something they couldn't categorize. I didn't need them to intervene. I only needed the quiet discomfort that precedes inquiry. Outside authority always enters after internal doubt begins. Mara stepped out onto the porch beside me. Her wrists were dry now, but the marks hadn't faded. She sat, tucking her knees close, trying to stay smaller than the moment deserved. "People saw," she whispered. "They did," I said, "and they didn't do anything. That's how this starts. It's not how it ends." Her eyes followed my gaze. Karen still talking, still gesturing, still believing the situation was hers to describe. The fake officer adjusted his radio, the device hissing faintly, picking up fragments of signals he didn't understand. He turned the volume knob too far, exposing the telltale echo that only emergency frequencies produce. A sound no civilian should hear in a neighborhood like this. That was the first progression of the strategy: direct witnessing, not by me, by everyone else. A fake badge, illegal restraints, unauthorized radio traffic. The combination formed the kind of pattern outside agencies notice immediately once they're alerted, and they would be alerted. Not now, not in haste, not in anger. Procedure rewards patience. Mara leaned against me. I didn't put my arm around her. I didn't need to. The contact was enough to remind me why the bench mattered, why this neighborhood mattered, why the lines Karen crossed weren't symbolic, they were operational. Across the street, a resident stepped out, glanced toward the greenway, then toward our porch. A small motion, subtle, but acknowledgement. Karen noticed and stiffened, her posture shifting into defensive confidence. She adjusted her blazer, lifted her chin, and walked away from the scene with the officer trailing behind her. She thought the moment was closed. It wasn't. This was where jurisdiction widened and assumptions thinned, where the narrative she believed she owned would meet boundaries she didn't understand. And the porch, quiet, steady, unchanging, became the first place I recognized that her control had already begun to fail. Karen had barely turned the corner when the neighborhood shifted again. The quiet that followed wasn't peace, it was assessment. People remained behind their blinds a little longer, watching the space she'd occupied, trying to decide whether what they saw belonged in a neighborhood dispute or something far outside the HOA's reach. I stayed on the porch with Mara beside me, letting the moment breathe the way a controlled breaching room breathes before entry, slow, steady, inevitable. The next movement came from across the street. A figure stepped out from behind a parked sedan, hesitating before fully committing to the sidewalk, not hiding, not approaching. Just pausing in a way that told me he understood the weight of what he'd witnessed, but hadn't decided what to do with it. That posture, half forward, half withdrawn, was the hallmark of someone caught between responsibility and fear. It was Eldon Parr, the HOA treasurer. He stood at the edge of his driveway, arms folded too tightly against his chest, shoulders slightly lifted as if bracing for impact. His gaze went from the greenway to our porch, unable to settle. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, grounding himself and then immediately ungrounding himself. Conflict wasn't in his voice, he hadn't spoken yet. It was in the way he couldn't keep still, the way his hands flexed and relaxed, like he was rehearsing an action he might not take. He looked at me once. Not long. Not enough for acknowledgement, but enough to show he'd registered my presence. Then his eyes fell to Mara's wrists. His jaw clenched, a small, involuntary motion that betrayed more truth than words ever could. He hadn't known about Karen's security committee. He definitely hadn't known they were using restraints. He approached slowly, stopping again halfway, as if checking the distance between his courage and his caution. "Landon," he said finally, voice thin but steady. "What happened out there, it wasn't right." His body contradicted his words, arms still tight, breath shallow, gaze drifting toward the intersection where Karen had disappeared. He wasn't just worried about the truth. He was worried about being seen speaking it. Mara kept her eyes down. I didn't force the conversation. I let Eldon's hesitation form its own path. He rubbed the back of his neck, fingers pressing into the muscle like he was trying to break tension stored too long. "I tried to stop the vote," he muttered. "Or there wasn't a vote. She told us it was handled. She said the documents were signed. He cut himself off, swallowing words that didn't want to surface. That was his struggle. Not silence, not fear, but the realization that complicity could happen quietly, in small increments, through trust misused. I kept my tone level. "Did you approve a security authority?" His shoulders tightened again. He shook his head. "Not just a no, an ashamed no. The kind that comes from discovering your signature is attached to something you never agreed to." She said it was a volunteer watch group. She didn't mention badges or any of that. He didn't say handcuffs. He couldn't. His eyes kept flicking to Mara's wrists, then away, like the marks were louder than her silence. Behind him, another neighbor opened a garage door, saw us, and froze. Eldon noticed. His entire posture changed. He straightened slightly, then immediately shrank into himself, caught between wanting to step closer and wanting to retreat before Karen saw him talking to us at all. This was the part of the victory strategy that mattered, recognition, not confession. Eldon didn't need to expose Karen yet. He only needed to confront the truth inside himself. The doubt he carried would become the crack through which external authority entered later. And he felt that crack forming visibly in the tension of his shoulders and the shifting of his stance. "People saw what happened," he whispered. "They're talking. They just don't know what to do. That's why you're here," I said. Not a push, not a threat, just the plain fact of the moment. Eldon exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath since Karen arrived. He adjusted his glasses, wiped his palms against his jeans, and finally looked me in the eye, really looked. "If she's crossing lines, you're not the only one she's hurting." That was the first step. Not a commitment, not an alliance, but the visible fracture of loyalty to Karen's authority. He wasn't ready to stand with us. He wasn't ready to stand against her. He was in the space between dangerous to her, valuable to me. He stepped back toward his driveway. "Just be careful," he said. "She's pushing something bigger than the board knows." I nodded once. Not agreement. Recognition. As he turned away, his shoulders sagged not in defeat, but in the weight of truth he could no longer ignore. This story wasn't about what he said. It was about what his body betrayed. Before he reached his door, I spoke quietly not to him, but to the viewers who would eventually hear this story. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from, and hit subscribe if you've ever seen an HOA push past the limits they were given. Eldon paused, just for a second. Then he went inside. Nothing dramatic happened, but the shift had begun. Eldon's door closed with a soft thud, and the house lights behind his curtains dimmed one room at a time. The street settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that forms after people witness something they don't yet understand how to categorize. Mara lingered on the porch beside me, her breathing steadier now, though her shoulders carried the weight of what had happened. I stood, gave her a small nod toward the house, and watched her head inside. When the door clicked shut behind her, I remained outside a moment longer, letting the porch light hum against the early evening air. I knew the next escalation wouldn't happen here. Karen never repeated her moves in the same location. She preferred new ground each time, a different stage to reinforce whatever authority she believed she held. And she didn't wait long. The notification hit my phone first, an automated alert from the Pinebriar Crest resident portal. A violation notice. Not surprising. The timing was. It arrived barely 10 minutes after Eldon walked away. The text preview showed only the subject line, emergency compliance infraction, a phrase that didn't exist in any version of the bylaws. I opened it but didn't read the full message yet. Not here. Not on the porch. Procedure mattered. I stepped inside, told Mara I'd be in the study, and walked down the hallway to the room that overlooked the community pool. The study had always been the place where I assessed information, quiet, isolated, designed for clarity. Today, it became the new primary setting for the next phase of Karen's escalation. The pool deck outside was empty, umbrellas folded, water still. The wide concrete space reflected the fading daylight like a flat mirror, a controlled environment. Fitting that her next move would arrive while I was positioned here, overlooking a space she often used for board announcements and impromptu displays of authority. I finally opened the violation message fully. Your household is being placed under emergency review for obstruction of neighborhood security personnel. Mandatory meeting scheduled. Immediate compliance required. A second alert followed before I finished reading. This one wasn't from the HOA portal. It came from the neighborhood-wide message board, Karen's favorite tool when she wanted to shape perception. The text appeared as a broadcast-style announcement addressed to all residents. Unauthorized interference with designated safety personnel occurred this afternoon. Residents may notice increased enforcement measures. Increased enforcement. She didn't know the meaning of that phrase, not legally, not operationally, but the residents reading it wouldn't focus on legality. They'd focus on the authority implied by the wording. And that was her aim. Turn the narrative into one where her actions felt procedural, not personal. The victory strategy required watching these shifts, not responding, not challenging, just letting every misuse of power accumulate in the open where outside authority would have to acknowledge it. Through the study window, I watched a pair of neighbors walking past the pool entrance. They stopped when they saw the printed notice Karen had taped to the bulletin board. One leaned in to read it. The other folded his arms, mirroring the uncertainty I'd seen earlier on Eldon's face. That was the second progression of the strategy: community unease turning into community attention. Outward authority collapses fastest when multiple witnesses begin to question jurisdiction simultaneously. The violation notice itself didn't concern me. Her reach was predictable. Her confidence was predictable. Her misunderstanding of legal boundaries was predictable. The part that mattered was the timestamp. She'd filed it within minutes of leaving the Greenway. That meant she was reacting emotionally, not strategically, and emotional leadership always leaves a trail. Another alert hit my phone. This one from the HOA Security Status Update channel, something Karen had created months ago to notify residents of petty issues like trash bins left out or minor landscaping concerns. Today, she repurposed it. Be advised, a resident obstructed compliance operations earlier today. Patrol frequency will increase until safety is restored. Patrol frequency, compliance operations, safety restoration. Not one of those terms aligned with the rural suburb HOA charter Pinebriar Crest operated under, but she used them anyway. And she broadcasted them to every person in the neighborhood. With every push alert, she stacked evidence against herself. Lights flickered on across the pool deck as the automatic timers activated. The reflections on the water changed shape-sharp lines, shifting into softer, more distorted patterns. That distortion matched the way residents were starting to view Karen's authority. In the study, I sat at the desk and logged into the resident portal, not to respond but to archive each message. Screenshots, timestamps, sistin metadata. Not files from garages or basements, just the digital footprints she left willingly, public and unfiltered. This was the foundation of outside intervention, voluntary overreach documented plainly. A movement outside drew my attention. Karen herself was walking toward the pool entrance now, the fake officer trailing behind her again. They weren't patrolling. They were posturing. She checked the bulletin board, straightened the papers on it, and looked around like she expected someone to challenge her authority right there on the deck. No one did. But people watched from windows. Watching was enough. I leaned back, letting the silence settle. Karen believed escalation strengthened her position. She didn't see that it only widened the jurisdictional gap she was already falling through. This wasn't the moment authority broke. It was the moment it revealed its limits. Karen lingered on the pool deck with the fake officer behind her, both of them scanning the empty space as if expecting an audience. They didn't get one. Residents stayed behind their blinds, observing without participating, forming the kind of quiet record that becomes significant once authority is forced to account for itself. I remained in the study until they finally walked away. When their silhouettes disappeared past the hedges, I stood and moved toward the front of the house. The next step required a different vantage point, not another window. Something larger. Something that would let me see Pinebriar Crest the way outside responders would eventually see its structured terrain, mapped behavior, predictable patterns. I grabbed my keys, told Mara I'd be back in a few minutes, and stepped into the evening air. The new primary setting was the community's east overlook, a raised concrete platform above the retention pond, accessible by a narrow path lined with solar lights. The HOA used the overlook for morning yoga and summer announcements. Tonight, it served a different purpose. From here, you could see nearly the whole neighborhood, the greenway, the pool deck, the cul-de-sac where my house stood, and the rows of connected walkways Karen used for her patrol theatrics. As I approached the overlook, the subtle hum of insects rose against the fading light. A warm breeze moved across the pond, carrying the faint scent of algae and fresh mulch. It was a place designed to feel tranquil. Today, it became the perfect observation point for the next phase of the Victory Strategy professional assessment. I reached the platform and leaned on the railing. From this height, the patterns were unmistakable, the routes Karen favored, the spots where her fake officers hesitated, the distances between patrol points, and most importantly, the places where their illegal radios created interference with the ambient frequencies on my scanner. I pulled my phone from my pocket, not to call anyone. Not yet. I opened my spectrum analysis app, a tool I used for emergency systems consulting. The hillside gave me a clean scan of the neighborhood's signal behavior, and immediately I saw it, a spike. A narrow band of transmission flickering at intervals no civilian equipment should produce. The fake officer was still using his radio. I tracked the pulses. They moved, slow, uncertain, coming from the direction of the clubhouse. That told me Karen had shifted operations away from the pool deck, choosing a new location to enact her version of enforcement. Every time he pressed the transmit button, the app caught the signature echo one I recognized from years of tactical operations, restricted frequencies, emergency routing, unlicensed interference. That was the discovery, not from documents, not from basements, but from live environmental analysis professional observation with a vantage point only height provided. I captured the data, timestamp, signal pattern, frequency variance, all cleanly documented in real time, and all publicly traceable if a federal agency needed to verify it later. Below the overlook, a few residents walked along the path, glancing toward the clubhouse with uneasy curiosity. They were starting to notice the patrols weren't just nosy volunteers. They were pretending to be something else entirely. Their unease would support the external intervention later, even if they never spoke a word. I stayed on the overlook another minute, letting the data accumulate. Every transmission was another piece of evidence tied directly to the impersonation. Every flicker of the signal was another overreach Karen broadcasted without realizing it. As the sun dipped lower, the clubhouse lights flicked on. Through the window, I saw Karen moving papers across a table with rigid precision. Her confidence grew when she controlled a room. She assumed no one was watching her from above. She assumed her authority was the only one that mattered. Assumption is the most fragile form of power. I took a breath and closed the app. The air cooled slightly as evening settled over the water. The path behind me glowed in soft white light, each solar lamp flickering faintly. I started back toward the neighborhood, the dirt crunching under each step. This phase wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about responding to her violations. It was about letting them accumulate in plain sight, stacking one breach atop another, until outside authority wouldn't need to be convinced, just notified. When I reached the intersection near the tennis courts, a neighbor walking his dog slowed as he passed. He didn't speak, but he nodded once, the kind of nod people give when they've seen enough to realize something is wrong but haven't yet decided how to act. That was the shift I needed. I kept walking, calm and steady, the way a man moves when he knows the terrain is on his side. Before entering the house, I looked once at the camera and said quietly, "If you're following this story, tap subscribe so I know you're still here. You're going to want to see where this goes." Then I stepped inside, leaving the overlook behind. The door closed behind me with a muted click, and the familiar quiet of the house settled around us. Mara sat on the couch with her knees pulled close, the glow of the living room lamp softening the tension in her face. She looked up when I entered, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The overlook had given me the data I needed now. The next step required a different setting, entirely one grounded, public, and impossible for Karen to manipulate. "Come with me," I said gently, not an order, an invitation. She followed as I stepped back out into the evening, guiding her toward the walking path that led to the community's west gazebo, a small wooden structure tucked between two rows of pines. Families used it for picnics and birthday decorations in the summer. Tonight, it became the next primary setting for what had to happen. The moment the stakes shifted from observation to personal resolve. The gazebo lights flickered on as we approached, their amber glow spreading across the wooden floorboards. It felt contained, neutral. A place separate from the greenway where she'd been humiliated, and separate from the overlook where I gathered the signal evidence. Here, the space didn't hold memory, it held possibility. Mara stepped inside and sat on the bench near the railing. For a moment she looked like she was trying to fold into herself again. I sat across from her, giving her the distance she needed. "You okay?" I asked. Her answer was a slow exhale. Everyone was watching, but no one did anything. "That's usually how it starts," I said. "People freeze when authority presents itself, even when it isn't real." She rubbed the faint red marks on her wrists. The gazebo fan turned quietly above us, pushing warm air in slow circles. Her voice dropped lower. "Is she going to keep doing this?" "Not for long." She studied me then, trying to read something in my face. I kept my expression neutral, steady. The structure of the victory strategy didn't require her fear or my emotion, it required clarity. And she deserved to know that clarity belonged to her as well. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small receiver I'd brought. Not the scanner I used earlier. A simple fragment of the Emergency Analysis Toolset 1 designed to catch signal bleed in real time. I set it on the bench between us. The red indicator pulsed faintly. "What's that?" she asked. "Proof," I said. "They're still transmitting on restricted frequencies." She stared at the device for a long moment, her brows tightening as the implications sank deeper. "So they're breaking the law right now." Every time they pressed that button, her hands curled slightly, not in fear but in a new, steadier emotion ownership of what had happened to her. The device pulsed again longer this time. A different pitch. A frequency shift. That shift was the escalation. Not dramatic, not loud, but significant. It meant Karen had expanded her false patrol radius, pushing farther into areas where emergency channel interference wasn't just unlawful, it was detectable by municipal towers outside Pinebriar Crest. Once the interference reached a certain threshold, it wouldn't matter whether anyone reported it. The system would detect it automatically. That was the progression of the strategy personal stakes merging with operational boundaries. It wasn't enough that Karen overstepped her authority. She had begun interfering with systems that didn't belong to her at all. Mara watched the pulsing light, her voice smaller now. I keep thinking about the officer, the way he looked at me, like he thought I couldn't say no. You didn't have to, I said. He crossed the line the moment he touched you. The device pulsed again. Stronger. Nearer. The clubhouse wasn't the only location anymore. They were moving. I stood and walked to the railing, looking out through the pines. The night was growing thicker, shadows stretching over the trimmed grass. A jogger passed on the trail with a quick glance in our direction. Farther away, faint voices carried from the direction of the clubhouse, Karen's cadence unmistakable even through trees and distance. She was ramping up. She believed control was tightening in her direction. In reality, the signals told the opposite story. Her interference was spilling into detectable airspace. Mara stood beside me. What happens now? Nothing you need to worry about, I said. Just know this isn't the part where we fight. It's the part where everything she's doing becomes visible to the people who actually have jurisdiction. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. Not relief. Alignment. Behind us, a neighbor crossed the path and paused briefly at the edge of the gazebo light. He didn't speak, but he watched the receiver's pulsing glow with a frown before continuing his walk. Another witness. Another sign. The air shifted as a breeze rolled across the pond behind the trees. I pocketed the receiver and rested my hand on the railing. This, I said quietly, is where the stakes change. The wind shifted again, carrying the low rustle of pine needles and the faint echo of distant voices from the clubhouse. I pocketed the receiver, and Mara and I stepped off the gazebo platform, moving toward the path illuminated by scattered solar lights. The night wasn't late yet, but the neighborhood had already grown still too still for a place that usually buzzed with dog walkers and evening strollers. People were watching from shadows, waiting for someone else to make sense of what they'd seen. We reached the curve near the retention pond when a motion from the left caught my eye. Someone stood under the dim street lamp by the old stone planter, shoulders hunched, head lowered, hands nervously adjusting the hem of a jacket. Even before he shifted his stance, I recognized the conflicted posture. Eldon. He'd been waiting, maybe rehearsing, maybe reconsidering, but he stepped forward when he saw us, as if something in him had finally outpaced his fear. Landon, he said quietly. His voice held tension, but his body said more, one foot planted, the other angled away, ready to flee if anyone else appeared. His fingers tapped rapidly against his thigh, then stopped, then started again. The fight inside him wasn't loud. It was subtle, the kind of inner turmoil that builds over months of witnessing small abuses, only to break open after one unmistakable violation. I motioned for Mara to stand slightly behind me, not out of protection but to give Eldon the space he needed to speak. He swallowed hard, then looked down at his hands like they were holding a truth he didn't want to carry. There's something you need to know, he said, about Karen, about why she formed that committee. His breath shivered on the exhale. He wasn't cold. He was grieving something he didn't want to put into words. It's about the dog, he continued. My daughter's dog, Daisy. Mara stepped closer, her expression softening. She knew something about losing something small and irreplaceable. She understood that tone. Eldon's shoulders tightened before he spoke again. Daisy had seizures. My daughter's therapist recommended a comfort animal for the panic episodes she gets during storms. We had the paperwork, the tags, everything. He paused, inhaling unsteadily. Karen said Daisy violated noise restrictions, said service exemptions didn't apply because we weren't a multifamily building. She threatened fines, daily ones, and when Daisy barked once during maintenance, Karen said the security committee could remove a nuisance animal. He didn't need to finish the sentence. His whole body crumpled inward, the truth slipping out with the weight of memory. My daughter found Daisy gone when she came home from school. Karen had relocated her. She called it compliance action. Mara drew a sharp breath. I felt something shift under the surface of the night, subtle, quiet, but deeply human. That's why you're afraid of her, I said. He nodded, eyes glassy, though he blinked quickly to hide it. My daughter hasn't slept right since. The therapist says the trauma reset her progress. Karen refused to apologize. She said emotional dependence wasn't a legal exemption. His voice broke, then steadied with visible force. She thinks authority means ownership. And now she's escalating the same behavior with uniforms and radios and procedures she doesn't understand. The confession wasn't just information, it was a fracture in the system that supported Karen, and fractures, once exposed, become points of entry for outside intervention. Eldon looked around again, checking shadows, checking windows. There's more. She forged the approval forms. The board never voted for enforcement rules. She printed the badges herself. And those radios? He shook his head. She ordered them through a reseller who specializes in surplus, not legal distribution, not licensed. That tied directly into the victory strategy. Outside authority didn't need emotional context, they needed operational breaches. Tonight, Eldon had provided both. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal tag engraved, worn, still carrying scratch marks near the edges. Daisy's collar tag. He held it between his fingers like it was the last solid proof his daughter's trust had ever existed. "I kept it," he whispered. "I couldn't throw it away." Mara stepped forward, touching his arm gently. He didn't flinch. He just breathed, long and shaky, as if releasing the truth allowed him to stand a little straighter. "You're not the only one she hurt," Eldon said. "But you're the first person she pushed who actually knows how to hold her accountable." He placed Daisy's tag in my hand not as evidence, but as acknowledgement of what we both understood. Karen's pattern wasn't new. It was just finally visible. "Whatever you're planning," he said quietly, "I'm ready to help." His posture changed, then no longer half forward, half backward, fully present, fully aligned. This was the moment the community shifted, and the moment outside authority would eventually find its anchor. Eldon stood there beneath the street lamp, the small metal tag still warm in my hand. His breathing had steadied, his shoulders no longer pulled inward. A decision had settled in him, the kind that reshapes the balance inside a neighborhood long before anyone realizes power has shifted. I nodded once, acknowledging what he'd shared, and he stepped away, heading toward home with a posture more upright than when he arrived. Mara and I walked back along the path until we reached the main sidewalk that led toward the community tennis courts. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of clay and trimmed hedges. That was where we needed to go next, not for recreation, not for confrontation, but because the courts offered the one vantage point where the neighborhood intersected physically with the outer perimeter. A place where local boundaries met municipal ones. Tonight, it would become the primary setting for the strategic phase I'd been preparing for since the handcuffs closed on my daughter's wrists. The court sat behind a chain-link fence, locked after dusk, but the benches outside remained accessible. I took a seat on the far bench overlooking the stretch of pavement leading toward the utility access road. Mara sat beside me, folding Daisy's tag gently between her fingers. Eldon had let her hold it before walking away, and she handled it with the same careful respect someone would give a memory they never witnessed but understood deeply. "Why here?" she asked. "Because this is where everything connects," I said. "Signals, boundaries, jurisdiction. And because the tennis courts, unlike the clubhouse or the greenway, sat exactly between HOA property and city maintenance territory. Anything transmitted here, anything intercepted here, anything documented here carried a path straight into systems Karen didn't know existed. I set the receiver on the bench again. The red pulse was steady at first, then flickered. A faint crackle followed a static-like tremor that wasn't random. It was the echo of the patrol radio the fake officer carried. They were moving closer to the perimeter now, extending their enforcement loop. Karen didn't know it, but each step they took in this direction placed their unauthorized transmissions closer to municipal scanning range. Evidence doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it emerges from the quiet way a system interacts with its own limits. Another pulse, sharper this time. Mara leaned forward. "That's them again?" "Yeah. They're everywhere tonight. They're loud," I corrected. "People who pretend to hold authority always are." The device pulsed again. The signal strength spiked higher than I'd seen earlier. I opened the analysis app not for a wide scan like before, but for proximity mapping. The frequency distortion appeared in 3 clean lines, indicating the signal was bouncing off nearby structures. That meant they were extremely close. close enough that the interference levels would register on municipal relay nodes if they continued in this direction. I captured the data. Each pulse became a new entry, each spike a new timestamp. Outside authorities wouldn't need my interpretation, just the raw logs. The night deepened. The hum of streetlights replaced the sound of passing residents. In the distance, footsteps echoed against pavement. 2 figures turned the corner near the maintenance road, the fake officer in front, Karen behind him with her blazer now draped over one arm, her posture crisp and self-assured. They hadn't seen us yet. Mara tensed slightly. I didn't touch her shoulder, but I made sure she saw my calm. "This isn't their space," I said quietly. "They think it is, but it isn't." As they approached the fence line, the receiver pulsed again so strong the device vibrated slightly against the bench. I watched them silently. Karen tapped something on her phone, then raised her chin like she was inspecting the area for imaginary infractions. She had no idea the ground beneath her authority had already shifted. The more confidently she walked, the more clearly she exposed her own ignorance. She turned away eventually, heading back down the path with the officer trailing her. The receiver dimmed again as their signal drifted out of range. Not one word exchanged, not one confrontation, just observation, procedure, evidence. When they vanished from sight, I pocketed the device and stood. "That's enough for tonight," I said. We walked toward home, passing houses with dim porch lights and curtains pulled tight. People were watching, even if they didn't admit it, and that mattered. Quiet acknowledgement always precedes external involvement. At the intersection leading back to our street, I paused and glanced toward the camera mounted on the lamp post. For a moment, I let the weight of the night settle. Then I spoke softly. "If you've made it this far with me, hit subscribe so I know you're following every step. You'll understand why soon." Mara looked at me, and I could tell she felt it too, the shift, the inevitability. We turned the corner toward home, leaving the tennis courts, our quiet, strategic ground, behind. We turned onto our street with the tennis courts fading behind us, the night carrying that soft, suspended quiet that follows a shift people don't fully understand yet. Porch lights glowed like small anchors across the cul-de-sac, each one marking a house where someone had watched part of this unfold. Mara walked beside me, her steps steady, more assured than earlier. She didn't cling to the silence. She inhabited it. That mattered more than anything Karen believed she could enforce. As we approached our driveway, I slowed. The next phase required a space farther from home-neutral central and structurally tied to both HOA governance and community visibility. A place where preparation didn't look like preparation. The community garden. We had several small maintained plots arranged along a long gravel walkway with raised beds, a pergola, and a shared tool shed Karen rarely inspected unless she wanted to perform her role publicly. At night, the garden stayed unlocked, lit by low ground lamps and a few strings of solar bulbs. It was open, quiet, and perfect for the next strategic positioning. I told Mara to head inside and rest. She nodded without argument. Whatever fear she'd carried earlier had reshaped into something steadier, and she trusted the structure of what we were doing. Once she was safely inside, I turned and headed down the path toward the garden. The gravel shifted under my shoes as I stepped through the wooden archway. The air smelled like damp soil and rosemary, and above me the solar bulbs glowed faintly in loose strands. This was the new primary setting, the location where preparation became action without appearing confrontational. I walked slowly between the raised beds, stopping near the herb section where the pergola cast long shadows. From here I could see 3 paths, one leading back toward the clubhouse, one toward the retention pond, and one toward the central loop where Karen often staged her announcements. It was a natural crossroads ideal for observing without intruding. I pulled out the receiver and placed it on the edge of a planter. The device flickered to life, pulsing in faint rhythms. The signal strength was lower here, muted by distance, but it was still present. Distant transmissions from Karen's unauthorized equipment carried through the air like static waiting to be traced. This part wasn't about gathering more proof. It was about aligning everything so that when outside authorities stepped in, they would find a narrative already established by Karen's own patterns, not my interpretation of them. The strategy demanded patience, not provocation. The receiver flickered again. This time, the pulse came with a multi-signal echo, 3 overlapping transmissions, not one. If the fake officer had been joined by another volunteer, that meant Karen was expanding her pseudo-patrol. Increased movement meant increased interference. Increased interference meant broader detection. Another resident entered the garden through the opposite gate. She wore headphones and carried a small basket for herbs. She saw me but didn't stop. Instead, she offered a small nod, the kind people give when they know something is wrong but haven't yet connected all the pieces. She moved to the far corner of the garden, keeping her distance but watching the paths occasionally. Her presence mattered. Witnesses weren't just people who saw events, they were people positioned in the right places at the right times, creating a pattern of awareness that supported outside intervention. Karen's authority thrived on silence. The garden tonight wasn't silent. The receiver pulsed a third time, stronger, clearer. I tapped the screen marking the timestamp, not because I needed it tonight, but because it would matter later. I stepped under the pergola and leaned against one of the wooden posts. The lights above hummed faintly. The air felt colder than the earlier evening. Something about this moment, the quiet, the distance from the house, the vantage point made the shift feel even more defined. From the path toward the clubhouse, I heard movement, soft footsteps, a low murmur. I shifted slightly and saw two silhouettes passing near the far hedges, Karen and the fake officer again. They weren't patrolling, they were searching. She gestured wide, aggressive, like she was dissatisfied with the compliance enforcement so far. He nodded repeatedly, adjusting his radio with forced professionalism. Their route took them closer to municipal boundary lines again, closer to detection range. They didn't realize their own actions were feeding the structure poised to intervene. I watched silently as they continued on, their steps eventually fading behind the pines. The resident at the herb bed looked up, tracking them with narrowed eyes. Her attention lingered long after they passed. I pocketed the receiver, letting the final pulses fade. The preparation was complete. Outside authority didn't need my argument, they needed the pattern Karen had built for herself. I walked out of the garden, gravel crunching in soft rhythm beneath each step. No confrontation, no warning, just alignment. By the time I reached the intersection near my house, the inevitability of what came next felt as real as the cold air settling around the neighborhood. Nothing else needed to happen tonight. The system was already turning. The cold settled deeper as I walked the last stretch toward the house, gravel dust fading from my shoes and the quiet of the garden giving way to the softer hum of porch lights lining the cul-de-sac. Part of me expected Karen's silhouette to reappear somewhere along the path, but the neighborhood had gone still again, still in the way places become when they're waiting for something to arrive. The inevitability had taken shape. All that remained now was positioning. Before stepping inside, I looked across the street toward the Community Recreation Hall, a squat brick building with a slanted roof and a wide front entryway that faced directly toward the central loop. It was rarely used after dark, except for late board work or storage checks. Tonight, though, it became the next necessary setting. A place with high visibility, clear sight lines, and security cameras Karen herself insisted be installed 2 years earlier. It was the perfect location for the final setup before everything shifted into the authority that she could neither control nor avoid. I crossed the street and walked toward the hall. The security lights clicked on as I approached, casting a pale wash over the walkway. The air near the building felt sharper, cleaner, more open. From here, you could see straight down the entire length of Pinebriar Crest's main road, every intersection, every bending curve of sidewalk, every point where Karen had tried to impose her version of control. The door was locked, as expected. I didn't need to go inside. The exterior was enough. The building's corner, with its mounted security camera and brick alcove, offered a perfect vantage point. This wasn't about hiding. It was about clarity, creating a position where any movement in the neighborhood could be observed, documented, and aligned with the signals I had been tracking all evening. I leaned against the brick column and watched the curve of the street. The receiver pulsed faintly in my pocket, picking up distant interference, but nothing within immediate proximity yet. That would change soon. Karen's pattern had been growing more predictable with each hour. She escalated when she felt watched. She intensified when she believed the narrative slipping from her control. And after passing through the garden earlier, she would almost certainly direct her so-called patrol toward areas where she thought she could reassert visibility. The recreation hall's exterior lights buzzed softly. A leaf skittered across the pavement. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then fell silent. I remained still, scanning the street, letting the calm settle in my bones. This part wasn't adrenaline. It wasn't conflict. It was alignment the moment before external jurisdiction stepped into the path Karen had carved for them. A movement near the central loop caught my eye. At first just a shadow, then a figure, then two. Karen and the fake officer again. She stood rigid, arms folded, her posture sharp even from this distance. He hovered behind her, adjusting his radio anxiously. They paused at the loop's entrance, turning slowly as if searching for something or someone. She lifted her phone and tapped rapidly, her face lit by the screen's glow. Then she did something new. She gestured toward the far end of the loop, where the neighborhood maintenance road met the municipal access lane. She was pushing farther outward, beyond the boundaries of the HOA's geographic authority, beyond even her imagined reach. The receiver pulsed in my pocket, stronger now, catching the distortions of her officer's radio as he tried to recalibrate it. Emergency frequency interference increased each time he pressed the transmit key. The municipality's network would pick it up soon, if it hadn't already. I watched as they walked farther, past the final row of homes, past the hedges that marked the edge of Pinebriar Crest property, and toward the narrow line where HOA responsibility ended and city jurisdiction began. They didn't hesitate. That was the final alignment. The moment external authority no longer needed my involvement to take notice. The moment the pattern crossed into a system designed to detect exactly this kind of behavior. Behind me, the recreation hall's security camera glinted faintly, its red indicator light blinking steadily. It wasn't my lens. It wasn't my evidence. But it had just recorded the exact moment Karen expanded her unauthorized patrol beyond everything the HOA charter allowed. A car turned the corner behind the clubhouse, slowing when its headlights washed across the two figures near the access road. The driver hesitated, watching them with confusion. Another witness, another entry point into the collective understanding of what Karen had done. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the air. Everything was in place. The signals, the witnesses, the overreach, the jurisdictional breach. This wasn't the moment of intervention. It was the moment the system recognized. It was time. I stepped away from the recreation hall's wall and walked back toward home, calm and steady, the receiver silent now in my pocket, not because the transmissions had stopped, but because everything necessary had already been captured. The next movement was no longer mine to make. I walked home from the recreation hall with the same steady pace I'd kept all night, the air still sharp, the street still quiet in that expectant way that meant the neighborhood was no longer pretending not to watch. When I reached my driveway, I saw two things at once: porch lights flicking on up and down the block, and the glow from the clubhouse windows across the loop. The public meeting. Karen had moved fast, faster than usual, which meant she was nervous. Public meetings were her preferred stage, but she only called them without notice when she needed to reclaim control. And tonight, she needed control more than she needed strategy. That alone said everything. I crossed the street toward the clubhouse. The walkway lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. As I approached, voices drifted out, low murmurs, quick whispers, the scraping of metal chairs being pulled into rows. When I stepped inside, every head turned. The main hall was full. Residents lined the back wall. Others sat rigidly in folding chairs. The mood wasn't hostile, but it wasn't neutral either. It was taut, like everyone had felt something build over days and finally reached the point where silence no longer served them. At the front stood Karen Mallory, spine straight, lips tight, her fake officer positioned behind her with his hands clasped stiffly in front of him. A printed stack of notices sat on the podium. She looked at me the way people look at a problem they believe they had already solved. "Good evening," she said, voice louder than necessary. "This is an emergency compliance review. We've had disruptions today that threaten the safety and order of Pinebriar Crest." A few residents exchanged glances, not supportive ones. She continued, "Certain individuals interfered with authorized safety personnel. Misconduct of this kind has consequences. She didn't use my name. She didn't need to." Every eye in the room shifted toward me, not accusing, expectant. I walked to the left side of the room, taking a place near the long table usually reserved for sign-in sheets. I didn't sit. I didn't speak. I just stood, hands steady at my sides, watching Karen circle the podium. She lifted the first sheet. We will be issuing fines and mandatory compliance sessions to ensure this doesn't happen again. A voice broke the stillness. Why were there handcuffs? It came from the middle row. A father with his young son beside him. The entire room turned toward him, and then back to Karen. She blinked. The situation required restraint. It was a child, another resident said. More shifting. Small fractures in the room's silence. Karen straightened. Our safety unit, that's not a real thing, someone near the back said. We looked through the bylaws. Ripples moved across the room. Residents leaning forward. Residents nodding. Residents waiting for a real answer. I didn't step forward. I didn't need to. Outside authority doesn't enter through noise, it enters through undeniable pattern. Tonight, Karen was building that pattern with every sentence she tried to force into place. She gestured toward her officer in a sweeping motion meant to reestablish confidence. This community requires structure. Or their compliance. Some of you may not understand the role of enforcement. Enforcement of what? A woman near the aisle asked. Radio interference? Because that's what we heard. Illegal channels. That one stopped the room cold. Karen froze. Her officer's posture collapsed just slightly, chin lowered, shoulder angle shifting inward, the guilt written in involuntary motion. I lifted the small receiver from my pocket, not activated, not waved, just held it at my side. Its presence alone drew a cluster of eyes. One resident whispered, "Is that what I think it is?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. This wasn't my confrontation. It was theirs. A resident near the front stood. "Karen, we saw your patrol by the maintenance road tonight. That's city property. You don't have authority there." Another voice added, "We heard the radios popping. That's not neighborhood watch equipment." Then another, "You detained a teenager, a resident's child." The room shifted fully, now doubt becoming recognition, recognition becoming collective pressure. Karen gripped the podium, knuckles whitening. "This meeting is out of order, no," Eldon said quietly from the right side of the room. He stepped forward, shoulders squared, voice steady. "You're out of order." The entire hall went silent. He looked at the crowd, then at her. "You forged approvals. You misled the board. You authorized equipment we never sanctioned." A murmur swept through the room, louder this time, carrying the first true spark of community alignment. Karen's face drained of confidence. Eldon finished. "And you hurt people. You hurt my daughter. You hurt his." He nodded toward me. "And you've been hiding behind authority you don't actually have." Every resident turned toward her. This was the public fracture. The moment the HOA president lost the room, outside intervention was already moving. It would arrive soon. But tonight, the collapse began here with witnesses. Questions. Truth spoken in a hall she thought she controlled. I remained still, hands steady. This wasn't the confrontation. This was the point of no return. The room didn't move after Eldon spoke. It held stillness the way a landscape holds its breath before a storm breaks. Karen's hand tightened on the edge of the podium, her face caught somewhere between denial and the realization that her authority had just fractured in front of the one audience she needed most. The fake officer shifted behind her, his posture collapsing into something small, uncertain, almost childlike. The silence wasn't waiting for her explanation, it was waiting for the consequences, and they arrived. Not with noise, not with any dramatic entrance. Just the unmistakable sound of heavy boots approaching from outside the clubhouse doors, measured, unified, purposeful. Authority has a sound when it walks. It doesn't rush. It doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives because the system has been triggered. The double doors opened. 2 city officers stepped in first, scanning the room with the calm, practiced assessment of people used to stepping into situations already halfway collapsed. Behind them came the municipal communications supervisor, his badge clipped to his belt, his radio mounted differently from anything Karen's volunteer carried. And behind him, because the jurisdiction breach had been severe enough to trigger escalation, a tactical response pair moved in wearing subdued gear, not full SWAT loadout, but unmistakably from the same command structure I once worked under. The crowd didn't speak. No one needed prompting. They parted instinctively, creating a clear path from the entrance straight to the podium. Karen's face drained of color. Her officer stepped back, stumbling once before catching himself. The municipal supervisor addressed her with the same procedural tone I had heard hundreds of times in my old line of work. "Ma'am, we're here regarding reports of signal interference and impersonation of law enforcement authority within this jurisdiction." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply read the reality she had created for herself. Karen swallowed hard. "This is a private HOA matter, it isn't," he said, his tone flat, controlled. Restricted emergency frequencies were accessed. A minor was unlawfully detained. Unauthorized patrols crossed into city-managed space. That places this outside HOA authority entirely. Her mouth opened, but nothing coherent formed. She searched for a rule, a clause, a phrase she could wield like a shield. None came. One of the tactical officers glanced toward me, briefly, not recognition in a personal sense, but recognition of posture. I wasn't hiding in the crowd. I wasn't speaking over anyone. I stood steady, calm, aligned with the inevitability of the moment. The residents stood in collective silence, not emboldened, not rebellious, but relieved. They understood now. This wasn't about fines or violations. It never had been. It was about power misused, authority fabricated, boundaries crossed without comprehension. The supervisor turned to the fake officer, set the device on the table, and stepped back. The man obeyed immediately, placing his unauthorized radio on the podium with shaking hands. The tactical pair retrieved it, scanned it, and exchanged a short professional nod, the kind that said everything they needed was confirmed. Eldon stepped forward then, quietly but firmly. She forged board approvals. None of us authorized any of this. His voice didn't waver. His shoulders stayed straight. It wasn't bravery, it was clarity. The supervisor nodded once. "We'll need formal statements. From several of you." Residents murmured. Not anxious, not defensive, ready. Karen's voice cracked. This is a misunderstanding. It's documented," the supervisor said. "And the documentation all came from your actions." With that, the officers asked her to step forward. She hesitated only a second, long enough to realize no one in the room would defend her. Not the board, not her volunteers, not the neighbors she had governed with intimidation disguised as structure. When she stepped away from the podium, the room released a collective breath. Not applause, not anger. Just the soft exhale of a community finally free from pressure it hadn't recognized until now. The officers escorted her and the fake volunteer toward the doors. As they passed me, Karen didn't look up. The moment was larger than both of us. It didn't need acknowledgement. The doors closed behind them. The room stayed quiet for several seconds before residents began talking in low, relieved voices. Some hugged. Some shook their heads. Some simply stood there, letting the tension drain from muscles they hadn't realized were clenched. Eldon approached me, Daisy's absence still sitting in his eyes, but his posture steady. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not letting it happen again." "It wasn't just me," I said. "Everyone here saw it." He nodded. "Yeah, but you're the one who didn't look away." Outside, the tactical vehicle lights reflected off the windows as the officers helped Karen into a separate car, procedure unfolding exactly as it should. Mara appeared beside me then, quiet but grounded. She leaned lightly against my arm, not in fear but in resolution. "This is over," she said. "It is," I answered. But what mattered more was this. The neighborhood now understood the difference between authority and assumption. And once a community sees that line clearly, it never unsees it. I turned toward the camera mounted near the hall entrance. My voice stayed steady. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Then I walked my daughter home, the night finally calm.